I'd also like to mention a professor's, a University of Nebraska professor's study of the potential worst-case scenario with Keystone XL. As I said, it will move about 830,000 barrels of oil a day through Nebraska. And were a spill to occur in the Sandhills, for instance, Professor Stansberg of the University of Nebraska, he's an environmental engineer, says that, or has come to the conclusion that the worst case scenario for a sandhill spill would be up to 8 million gallons. The trouble with that is we don't know, we've had very little experience dealing with the removal of oil from a aquifer. We don't know, we haven't developed methods for doing it, and we don't know how significant or long-term the consequences of such a spill would be. And it would seem, again, that these sorts of measures need to be in place at a state level before the risk of such a spill is run. Now, I think why I'm here to speak is to talk about where federal authority ends and where state and county authority begins. Now, you all may have heard that the federal government has primary authority when it comes to regulating pipeline safety, and that is true. When it comes to regulations on pipeline thickness, pipeline pressure, the operation and construction of pipelines, those areas, when you're dealing with the safety issue, are originally in the federal government's hands. However, what the federal government does not have authority over, and in fact has been told they cannot regulate in any way, are questions of the pipeline routing. And what this means is that if pipeline routing is not a federal government area of jurisdiction, it is solely in the states, and if not in the states, in the counties' power to regulate pipeline routing. And I think I might put it another way when I say not only can the states and counties dictate pipeline routing, but if they don't do so, nobody else is going to do so for them. So, so that's something to be aware of when considering whether to exercise powers to, control siting of pipelines. Now, I'd like to mention some of the, resources that are at stake in Nebraska. Right now, as many of you probably know, 78% of Nebraska's public water system intake come from the Ogallala Aquifer. 83% of its irrigation water comes from the Ogallala Aquifer. Keystone XL is going to be moving through the heart of the Sandhills. It's going to cross within 100 feet of 29 water wells as well. So this is the present route of Keystone XL, or the route that TransCanada proposes. However, it's not set in stone. There's not a pipeline in that route, and it can be changed through the exercise of county and state authority. A good example, I'm going to use a Montana law that is one example of a state law that would allow a Nebraska-centric input to be considered in the routing of Keystone XL. Montana has a law called a Major Facility Siting Act. And what this act does is it puts in place a process in Montana for Montanans to participate in a review of alternative routes for major facilities, and if a facility is not permitted by the state under its provisions, then it doesn't get built. And let me tell you some ways that a similar law could play out in Nebraska. If Nebraska were to pass Montana's version of the Major Facility Siting Act, what you would have is TransCanada would need to not only tell Lincoln what its preferred route is for Keystone XL, but they would also have to consider alternative routes that would, some routes that would avoid the Ogallala and some routes that would avoid the Sandhills. Perhaps they would have to look at using the route that is along Keystone 1, and they would have to rigorously review all of those alternative routes and then put it before Lincoln to determine which route gets permitted. That process takes into place, takes into mind economic considerations. They take into mind environmental considerations, water supply, those sorts of issues that are important to Nebraskans. And it gives it would give Nebraskans a forum to have their input considered. Right now, because TransCanada is being considered, because it crosses a international boundary, the only alternative route consideration that is taking place is being done by the State Department, with relatively it's relatively sparse analysis. Essentially, the analysis comes down to the shortest route between Montana and Steel City is the route that TransCanada wants, and the State Department is declining to consider routes that would deviate from that because they'd be longer. Well, certainly if Nebraska had its own routing law in place, routes that avoided the Sandhills would be seriously considered, and the people of Nebraska would see to it that that consideration was done. So that's one area that the state could reroute Keystone XL. Counties themselves can have some impact on pipeline siting. Austin City has a ordinance in place that has that makes certain requirements on pipelines. Now, I have to say one area that both the state and counties cannot violate, in addition to not dealing with safety considerations, regulations cannot be so restrictive that they basically prevent a pipeline from being built. And what I mean by that is that if you had a regulation in say Franklin County saying no pipelines can be built in Franklin County, that would likely be found unconstitutional because there's something called the Commerce Clause that would violate. However, if as long as a regulation allows a pipeline to be practicably built in compliance with it, even if it costs more money to do so, it would still fulfill that particular constitutional requirement. So what counties can do is they can impact how facilities are built, the aesthetics of facilities. For instance, with a pumping station, they can dictate how much noise is coming from it, how far away from other buildings it needs to be. They can increase the sort of set-offs that pipeline facilities need to have. So counties themselves, by creating ordinances, can affect pipeline routing for economic and aesthetic reasons. Also, an important area is the regulation of kind of adjacent land use. And what I'm talking about here is hauling or hauler agreements. When a major project like Keystone XL comes up, it requires significant use of road infrastructure. You're going to have heavy trucks moving heavy equipment on very small county roads. If a county doesn't have an agreement to sign to basically require companies building these sorts of projects to rebuild the roads after they're done with them, then the county is faced with that liability. Essentially, if there's no agreement in place and huge roads destroy county roads, the county will have to repair them. However, if York County is a very good example of that. If a county has a ordinance requiring large construction projects to sign a hauling agreement with the county to ensure that roads are basically maintained during the construction process, that certain high-use roads are not utilized during the construction process, and that damage done to roads are repaired afterwards. Then that protects the county's interest during that process. The final thing I want to talk about is crude oil emergency response plans. Now, as I mentioned, all crude oil spills have hazards. Diluted bitumen spills appear to have additional hazards that we don't have processes in place for yet. But this highlights the need for both on a state and a county level in areas that have pipelines for emergency response plans to be required by officials. Let me start on the state level and tell you what that might look like. Washington State has a very good emergency response plan act. What it basically requires is that operators of oil pipelines and tankers have to have a contingency plan in place that talks about what kinds of oil they're moving, what will be required for small spills, large spills, medium spills, and where those assets are in place in the state and along the route. They also have to have preventative measures in place, as well as basically their emergency response plan and operation manual has to be accessible to the Washington state government. And what this does is it basically allows the state to review the emergency response plan and determine where weaknesses are in place, and they can work with pipeline operators before a spill to ensure that sufficient measures are in place to deal with that spill adequately. An analysis by Plains Justice of Keystone XL or Keystone 1, a pipeline that is moving, a smaller pipeline that has had 12 leaks already in the United States, shows that pipeline along its entire route, there's about 5% of the amount of boom that's used for spill response that Enbridge needed for one spill in Kalamazoo along a 5-state area. So right now, emergency response plans are untransparent. What we have for Keystone XL is a half-page paragraph basically saying they'll take care of the spill when it happens. We know that that's not enough. We know that operators have to have materials pre-positioned, and they have to have a process for dealing with the sort of spill that they reasonably can expect on their pipeline in place before the spill happens. With the Yellowstone spill, we've seen that Montana had huge amounts of difficulties getting Exxon's emergency spill response plan so that landowners could see what was being done and determine how to report spills that they were finding on their land. To my knowledge, they still have not received that. I haven't checked recently, but it took several weeks, or my information is accurate up to several weeks ago. So basically, what I'm highlighting is that there is a huge importance that laws getting these things, getting emergency response plans visible and available to the public need to be in place before spills start happening. And that can happen on a state level, it can also happen on a county level. And a final thing that those laws need to do is have a provision requiring operators to train local emergency responders to deal with spills. I mean, when a spill happens, it will be the local emergency responders who will be the first on the line. And they need to know what they're going to be dealing with and what the hazards will be for those substances. Now, I think I have gone over my time. and I have, I'll be happy to answer more questions, but I don't want to cut into our gentlemen from North Dakota and South Dakota who can discuss some real-world experience with the Keystone 1 pipeline spill. And I should mention, on a broad level, the Keystone 1 is TransCanada's first oil pipeline in the United States. It has been in operation for 1 year. It's moving diluted bitumen as Keystone XL would. And in 1 year of operation, it has had more than 30 spills in both the United States and Canada. 12 of them have been in the United States, and it's actually the youngest pipeline to have been shut down by our pipeline safety regulators because it was found an imminent threat to life, property, and the environment. Now, it's been restarted and it's being investigated by PHMSA, but it is a kind of a sign that we may not be a sign of the risks that we run with Keystone XL. But I will let my fellows